Well, you might say, how'd you get connected to Gordon-Conwell? Well, a lot of folks know Gordon-Conwell, and you appreciate Gordon-Conwell and the work that it's done, but you may not know that Tim Keller was also a student at Gordon-Conwell, so that connection is part of the reason that we're connected to Redeemer and to Tim Keller and to the plant that we had. Well, while Tim was a student here, he didn't know what he was going to do and what he was going to be part of, and we had those kind of connections. We didn't know what we were going to do and what we were going to be part of, and you say, okay, well, how did you make those kinds of things work? Well, while Tim was here, he tells this story as well, and I think it's part of our story because we have so many connections. In fact, one of the students at Fuller Seminary was in our church, and her dad was one of the reasons why Tim ended up where he ended up. So it kind of all comes together. This is the story of the sovereignty of God. So you say, okay, well, how did Tim end up where he is? Well, Tim was a student. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do, but there was a professor who was here at Gordon-Conwell at the time who really helped shape him and form him and get him to where he needed to go. Well, how did that professor end up here? Well, it was actually an interesting kind of story. That professor didn't have a way to come to the United States at the time, because he was overseas, he was teaching overseas, but Gordon-Conwell really wanted him to be here, to influence Tim, who ended up influencing New York, who ended up influencing us, and our connection to Gordon-Conwell. We ended up planting a church in Pasadena, California, and we come back here 20 years later to share the story. Well, if the professor was out of the seas, overseas, and ended up coming back here, how did he end up coming back here? Well, there was a student at Gordon-Conwell at the time who said, I can pull some strings and have a visa given to him and get him here so that he can teach Tim, that it eventually influences New York, that eventually influences Brannin and Tanya, that eventually brings us back here. Well, who was the student? Well, the student's name happened to be the person in our church's father. His name is Mike Ford. You say, okay, well, Mike Ford could pull the strings to get the professor to come to teach Tim, to get Tim to New York, to get us here, to get us back, all that. Well, who's Mike Ford? Well, Mike Ford is the son of Gerald Ford, the President of the United States. So he was here at the time who pulled the strings to get Tim and all that. Well, how did Gerald Ford become president? Watergate, right? Sovereignty of God, we are here because of Watergate. That's exactly why we're here. So, 20 years ago we were here, but we did not know exactly what we were going to do. We had a feeling that we wanted to be church planters, and we were studying, and we were growing, and we were learning all that we could, but we didn't know where we wanted to end up. Professors would ask us all the time, do you want to go back to Texas? And we thought for sure, possibly, we don't know. But we ended up taking a job in Dallas. We were the first church planting apprentices at this giant church in Dallas. And then we went back to New York over and over and over again to think that we were going to plant there. 9/11 happened shortly after we were in Dallas, and the funds dried up, and we took a small church outside of Dallas in kind of an interim position before we went to go plant. We wanted to find an area to plant that we really felt called to. And I think that that's important as we talk about understanding the gospel, its relevance in the cultural context that you're in. Calling is really important. Calling is something that draws you back over and over and over again to why you do what you do, and a deep understanding of the gospel. Well, Tanya and I had been trained very well at Gordon-Conwell. We had an amazing experience here. It is really home to us. Being back on campus has been sweet. I think that we were trained well in the knowledge of the gospel, but it was through a season in our life of brokenness that really grounded the gospel into our hearts. We took this small church outside of Dallas, and it broke us, completely broke us, to the point where I knew in my head that Jesus loved me, but I didn't know in my heart. And Tanya could say that our time together was just survival. There was a period where I wrestled with God. Lord, let us out of this church and place us somewhere else. And after 11 months, he finally did. And I think at that point, that transformational aspect of the gospel really hit home. I think we need to define the gospel more and more clearly as those seasons in our life happen. When that comes about, I don't think it's enough just to say the gospel is broad, is wide, is this. I think that we need to narrow it in and begin to define the gospel as the work of atonement and what Jesus has done, that he lived a life that we couldn't live, that he died a death that we couldn't die, in order that we might be reconciled with Jesus Christ, with God the Father through Jesus Christ, and by faith in him alone have salvation. After that comes all sorts of aspects of sanctification, the way in which we live and the way in which justice and mercy flows out of the gospel and the implications that it has of that. I needed that deeply rooted into my heart before we planted so that I might carry out a vision that I felt God calling us to when we were called to California. We didn't know that we were going to plant in Pasadena. We felt called to LA, and we'd gone to the folks at Redeemer and said, if we go to LA, where do we go? And they said, we don't really care. We don't have anything going on in LA. Why don't you go and figure it out? So we spent 3 years on the ground trying to figure out the lay of the land. We settled in Pasadena. It felt like an area in which we could minister to, and our full-on, head-on calling was to extend the love of Jesus Christ to those who may not know it. Now, that sounds simple and broad, but when you begin to define the gospel the way that we had through the atoning work of Jesus Christ, you begin to dissect the areas of the culture that you can say, these are the idols of the culture that we can address. When you have a definition of the gospel, and that's going forward, you're able to say, my vision that God has called us to is razor sharp in this area. We can't do all things for all folks, but we can carry out God's vision and calling for us in this area. And as we begin to address the idols of the culture, we began to see the way in which our church would be shaped and what it would look like and who we could reach. And so we are in the heart of Pasadena, Old Town Pasadena. We are neighbors, literally walking distance from Fuller Theological Seminary. We are walking distance from Caltech. We're driving distance, but everything's driving distance in LA. We're driving distance from JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is NASA. And so every day that we're in church, we look out and there's a PhD and a PhD and a PhD and a PhD and a PhD in astrophysics and whatever else, and it's just overwhelming. But the gospel remains the same. And we are able to discern the idols of the culture so that the gospel might go forward, so that they might experience and extend the love of Jesus Christ in their lives and beyond. Tanya's going to share with us a little bit about the idols that we've seen in California, and I'll come back and kind of wrap that in together, and we can open up for questions and answers. But why don't you tell us a little bit how we were able to see some of the gospel work in our culture and how we've been able to address it.
That's a hefty assignment, so I will definitely fail at that, but I'm happy to just be here with y'all and to share what Brannin and I have experienced. And like he said, we really felt motivated and compelled. We didn't want to just start another church, but we wanted to have the church be a platform, an avenue for people to feel and know the love of Jesus, and for that to be a motivating factor. And in order to have people be motivated, and ourselves as well, by Christ's love for them, and to have that deeply settled in their soul so that they don't have to race around trying to buy and serve and love everything else, we have constantly been evaluating what the idols of Pasadena, California are. What are our people being hit with? What is beating at our souls? What's competing for our worship? Because ultimately, an idol is simply what we worship. And the thing that has our what is compelling us? What is motivating us? What if we do not have this one thing or these few things? If we do not have it, we all of a sudden feel like we're worth nothing. So, Brannin and I have learned that trying to identify them and label them and name them is important, because then we can speak to it. We can train the leaders. Brannin can preach to it. And really try to get those things off the throne and put Christ on the throne. So as we moved from LA to Dallas with 3 little kids, from Dallas to LA, one idol that surprised us was the idol of recreation. Kind of odd. I'm labeling these by myself, so just for the record, I'm not actually sure that's been labeled in a list of something, but it is. And the amount that someone or a family can recreate in Southern California is at a direct relationship to how they are valued and made worthy in our culture. So if you can scoot off to the beach and rent an Airbnb, or if you can scoot off to the mountains for the day, then you have indicated that you have a good balance, you're not working too hard, you have enough money and resources to do that, and so you are then elevated. And being able to do that causes these folks to feel like their life is worthy. I'm just going to list a few idols that we've seen, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the gospel can penetrate those. So the second idol that Brannin and I really struggled with watching is an idol of emotion or feeling, where that is the authoritative voice in these people's lives. So people who have this idol, we've found, trust their feelings more than they do their mind. And if something doesn't feel right, if it doesn't look right, if it doesn't sound right, then they're just going to push it away and say that it's wrong. So, of course, ultimate truth is now, up for grabs, depending on how they feel. So when we preach Christ as love, they're all over it. When we preach Christ as merciful, forgiving, he is just, he wants to serve, they're on board. But when Christ's teaching and truth becomes confrontational to their feelings, no thank you. I'm not interested. And so their feelings and emotions dictate their happiness as opposed to what Christ did on the cross for them. They sort of ride that wave. And the last idol I'll mention is an idol of lifestyle and comfort. So this idea that I know what will make my life happy, and I am going to do anything I can to create that, and there's not an openness to the gospel to change and penetrate and move where they might be able to experience Christ more and serve him. So there's a woman in our church, I'll mention briefly. She has been struggling with secondary infertility. So she has one child and has really had a long and arduous road. She has drifted from the gospel as being her place of, it's no longer her shield, it's no longer her high tower. Christ and his atonement, what he's done for her, her security in that is no longer the driving force. The driving force is this desire to have a second child. And so I've been meeting with her and praying with her and holding her. And she told me, Tanya, I just want you to tell me that it's all going to be okay. And if you're not going to tell me that, I don't want to meet anymore. And as I left her house, I was jarred by the depth of this, I think, idol that she has put on the throne, saying, I will not be happy. I will not believe that God loves me if this does not come to pass the way I want it to come to pass. And I was wrought with love and concern and passion for her. And I called her and said, I cannot tell you that everything's going to be okay. It's not biblical, but I can tell you that Jesus, his love for you is enough. It is sufficient through whatever he has for you, and he is waiting to embrace you. It is these kinds of folks that Brannin and I have wanted to say, okay, what is holding them back from resting in the work of Jesus in their life? And when you can sort of name the thing that they're holding on to, we've found there's more of an opportunity to stare that in the face and help them come to a place of rest so that the gospel can be relevant in our culture and what people are struggling with. And while identifying idols is important to making the gospel relevant in our cultural context, Brannin and I have also kind of identified, Brannin, and I've just piggybacked on it, but 5 areas that need to be alive in the believer's life in order for them to be making the love of Christ imminently deep in their heart and then can usher out of it. So worship, fellowship, service, prayer, and study of the word. So when people come to us and share, I'm just not feeling it. I'm not feeling connected to the church. I'm not feeling connected to the community. I'm not really sure about this whole Christ thing. Then we have them evaluate those 5 areas and say which one of these areas or more is not alive and active in your life now. And normally it's the area that is coming specifically in juxtaposition to the idol that they're serving. So, for example, the idol of recreation causes people to miss worship all the time. So worship is now out of their diet. Speaking of your sermon, right? There's not this satiated desire to corporately worship. I'd rather just go skiing in the mountains. Because that really proves that I'm actually a better, more solidified, whole person in this area. So we found that those 5 areas can kind of help people decide maybe where they are disengaged and why they're feeling disengaged. You go ahead. That kind of gives you a little bit of a frame of where we're coming from.
I'll end up the way I always end up is some kind of self-deprecating remark, and that this has not been an easy road. I think we thought it would be right off the bat. We thought we're well trained. I'm incredibly good looking. It'd be hard for anyone not to come to Christ, especially if they heard my story. If they heard my story and how I came to Christ, people will just want to come and their lives would be changed. That's not the case. It's not the case for me. It's probably not the case for you. And it just doesn't happen that way. So we're 10 years into the church plant, a little bit over, and our church constantly sends people away. That may not sound great. We're a transient church. People come in, they're there for 2 to 3 years at the most, and then we're sending them away. So we're constantly praying for folks as they leave. They get connected. They find a church that they're finally feeling comfortable in, and then they leave. It has taken a toll on us, and our marriage has taken a toll on our kids. It has been hard, to say the least. But that calling keeps us coming back over and over and over again. And it actually reveals our own idols too, of what we've been struggling with. And the only way that we get out of that is to deal with it. We deal with it in all sorts of ways. We deal with it through therapy and counseling. We deal with it with mentors, with other pastors. We talk about it in our time together as Tanya and I are alone and trying to address what we're called to do and how we're supposed to handle the church. And then we're confronted with it every single day that we encounter someone in our community. Our community is broken up in a couple ways. We didn't feel like we could reach everyone in Pasadena. Pasadena is artificially divided by the 210 freeway, just north of Old Town Pasadena. In Old Town Pasadena, it's kind of a touristy attraction. People come and hang out. They live there. They work there. They spend time there. But African Americans and Latinos do not enter into Old Town very often. They're divided by the 210 barrier. So we did not feel like our church, independently, that I could reach or Tanya could reach someone north of the 210. So we wanted to be part of a church planting movement that could reach that area. We felt like when you walked out of the doors of our church, you ought to see people who look and think and act and do things like we do. And you do. You walk out and you see a church that's multi-ethnic like ours, but it's not quite the same. And so the idols that we're addressing affect folks who kind of live in this artificial bubble of Old Town Pasadena. We've got to be incredibly specific in who we're trying to reach and what we're trying to do, because once you cross that barrier, it's entirely different. And so we've had to think through ways in which we might contextualize and understand the culture even more in a city that is very compact and very tight and very explosive in the numbers of folks that kind of come in and move out all the time. It just takes a toll on you when you're constantly thinking that way. Who can I reach? What can I do? What can I handle? What can't I handle? I can't be Christ in skin for everybody, but who is Christ calling us to be his ambassadors to? So I think that we can take some time to answer some questions, but that's kind of a nutshell of who we are and what we've been part of. And if you're thinking about church planting, God help you. It is a wonderful thing. It is something that I don't think that we could do anything else. We're absolutely called to be church planters and to equip others to plant churches. But if you are thinking about that, let's talk. Our connections with City to City and with Los Angeles and with really the whole country in the major metropolitan areas, we'd love to help find an opportunity for you to apprentice or to plant or to be part of a church work. Skip Ryan, a good mentor and friend of ours, said that something I do believe, that everybody at some point in your life, in the life of your ministry, needs to be part of a church plant. And I thoroughly believe that. So.
Okay, let's bring you both up. Put you up front here while you all are thinking of some questions. I'm going to ask the first two just to warm the oven, so to speak. Here, there's some mics. We can pass them around. Two questions for both of you. What was, as you look back on your time here at Gordon-Conwell, your seminary days, what are just one or two things that struck you deep down in your soul that you can't forget? And then secondly, what were the big surprises after seminary that you didn't see coming?
What are the things that we can't forget and what are the things we didn't see coming?
Yeah.
Sure. I have a can't forget, for sure. One thing I deeply, deeply appreciate about Gordon-Conwell is, and I don't know if y'all actually still do this or not, but you used to have these grapples in the chapel where professors and learned men and women on different sides of non-salvific issues would come together and sort of grapple. And so what I felt, especially in this non-churched culture where most of your congregants don't really know church anymore and don't have a theological bone in their body or a denominational bone, it showed me grace. It showed me that you could have these learned men and women who absolutely did not agree with one another on certain issues. And they were both biblically minded, exegetical, thoughtful, spiritual, Christ-loving men and women. And so I think that, for me, ushered us forth into grace for where people are standing on issues that aren't salvific. So for me, that was, I loved that.
What can't you forget? Or what weren't you prepared for? You want time to think about it?
Well, it's just kind of depressing. But I just didn't know how exhausting full-time vocational ministry would be. And I'm not even paid by anybody. I just sort of...
It probably wouldn't be as exhausting if you were paid, right?
Maybe that's the problem. I need to get paid.
Yeah. What can't I forget? Probably two aspects of community. One with the students that we were part of living with here. We lived in Graham, right? Bell.
Bell.
We lived in Bell. And married housing down in Bell. the students that we were part of within that community were great and still are friends, and there was a deep sense of community that only takes place at a seminary like Gordon-Conwell, where you have the residency program. It was 3 years of rigorous, hard work, but we slugged it out together, and it was wonderful. And the second sense of community had to do with the professors. I was a little bit different, but and maybe that's why it's been 20 years since they invited us back. But I would literally bang on a professor's door and say, "I've got to take you to lunch. I've got to listen to you. I've got to hear what's going on." I didn't take no for an answer, and I just said, "You've got knowledge I need to know." And I don't learn well in the classroom. Tanya's degree hangs a little higher on our walls at home than mine. She finished summa cum laude, and I did not, so hers is about that much higher than mine. But I found that the community aspect of being with professors was wonderful, and I assume you can still do that.
Amen. Amen and amen. Especially if you're going to scare Professor Singleton.
And
Yeah, right.
then what were you not prepared
What was I
for?
not prepared for? Gordon-Conwell did a fantastic job of preparing us to have arrows in our quiver. We could exegete a passage. We learned to preach. We had learned to pastor. We had the tools, but applying that in the different context, in the cultural aspects that we were to face, it's just part of ministry. I'm not sure that anyone can be prepared for it. It's a little bit like, how many of you have kids? Right? You have your child, you're preparing to have your child, you get the room ready, you get the stroller, you have diapers, you have all that, but then you ask the question, have you ever been hit in the face with a 2x4, right? That's what it's like when you bring that child home. You just can't prepare for that, and I think that ministry is a lot the same. I don't think we actually, you may not know this, but 3 months into our seminary experience here at Gordon-Conwell, we were part of a denomination. We didn't know if we wanted to stay in the denomination or not. We went to the denominational seminary to see if that would be a better fit for us. So we fly out to St. Louis. We take a look. We go through a couple classes. Tanya says this is a fantastic seminary for her. She says it'd be awful for you. And she was dead right. I think that Gordon-Conwell did an excellent job in just setting the stage for us with understanding the types of folks that we'd be working with and dealing with, and how to think about it theologically, how to think about it with wisdom and with grace and biblically. So,
Well, and just to add to that, the reason why I thought it would be terrible for Brannin is the seminary was sort of spoon-feeding information from one vantage point, from one theological, denominational, slant, so to speak. And
they wanted to teach on baptism, and the class was on infant baptism. I said, great, well, when are you going to learn about believer baptism? They said, well, we're not. We're just going to learn about infant baptism. I said, I don't think everyone in my church is going to be.
Right. And so I think that kind of goes back to those grapples in the chapel, where here we were able to be fed from professors and friends that were coming from all sorts of denominations, theological backgrounds, and it was extremely beneficial than having just been spoon-fed. And then our congregants probably wouldn't have been spoon-fed the same thing, and it would have been a little bit harder to relate to them or to love them well.
Amen. Let's pass the microphone around if you've got some questions. Brannin and Tanya are graciously going to give us some time to open up the floor for discussion. And if you're thinking about seminary, you're welcome to ask some questions also, to be realistic and honest. David's going to start us off here.
Tanya, you identified a few idols in California, and a couple of those were maybe specific to California, and maybe a couple weren't so much. But I was wondering if you could speak to, either of you, to idols that you've observed in New England when you guys were students here, whether broadly to New England or even to seminary students in particular.
Well, being a huge Dodger fan, I think the Red Sox are an idol for New England.
You want to talk about the education?
Yeah, that's a good one. You can...
No, go for it.
Education. LA is not the hotbed of academic prowess in the United States by any stretch, but we actually live in the area of LA which should come close to it, which is not much at all. But New England, for sure. Education is an idol of the heart for many folks in the New England area. Whether it's your private school education or a boarding school or the fact that you're so close to the real institutions that shape culture through the academy, you know, MIT, Harvard, the BIT, you know. I think that's one of the idols that we noticed while we were here. Yeah.
Amen.
What do you? I don't know. I don't know Boston anymore.
I guess my follow-up question would be like, how would you minister in that? How would you approach that?
I think that's really the $1 million question. So I think that's where you've got to assimilate. You've got to be part of you've got to live and breathe and be part of everything that they're doing without becoming part of them. You've got to be so clear and separate in your calling and separation and understanding of how the gospel transforms you and can eventually transform the culture. But you've got to live in it, breathe it, drink it in. You know, be part of the soccer teams and the schools, and to where you become a Red Sox fan, right? Or you become a Patriots fan or whatever. You know, we're from Houston. All my life, I wanted the Astros to win the World Series until last year. Because we've become so dedicated. I mean, it's that kind of reality, right? That you're just living in it and breathing it. But it wears her out. She gets beat up and tired and frustrated, and because it's still not home, meaning eternal home.
Yeah.
Right.
So let me flip the question upside down also. I did and identified some of the idols of your particular context and how we exegete those idols, how we understand them in light of the gospel. How do you love LA? What about LA do you love now to see it flourish? Because that's very much part of who you guys are also. You belong to Pasadena. You belong to LA. What's it mean to love LA for you guys? What do you love about it?
I'll start. You can finish.
Don't start with the Dodgers.
Didn't love them so much last night. They, we a few years ago began to ask and wanted to answer the question, what does it mean to love LA? And so we set off a conference called Together LA, which we wanted to do that. And what that did was we wanted to identify the areas in our city that were flourishing in gospel influence, in kingdom-minded work. We wanted to say that even though this little tiny work of 25 folks in this East LA area was hardly recognized, it was a flourishing community of Los Angeles in terms of the gospel and the movement. We wanted to say, what does it mean to love LA is beyond church planting. It had to deal with issues of homelessness. It had to deal with issues of fatherlessness. It had to deal with issues of immigration and jobs and you name it. And so we wanted to touch on all those areas to say a flourishing city that's influenced by the gospel is a good city for all. We had to be able to say, in our church, in our particular context, we ask this question we make this statement all the time. We want folks in Pasadena, we want folks in LA, we want folks in the churches around us, the ministries around us to say, you know what, I may not agree with what they say, but I can't imagine the city without them because they do so much. That's an aspect of the gospel that is sanctification, but it's not the atoning aspect of the gospel, right? But it plays both hand in hand. And I think that when you have that deep sense of the atoning aspects of the gospel, you can live in the aspects of sanctification so much more freely. You're a non-empire building. It's non-territorial. It's the flourishing of the gospel. It's yourself dying so that others might be known, so that Christ might be known.
Amen. Amen.
I think one thing that has caused me to love LA and love Pasadena is we have identified 4 or 5 nonprofits in the area that are doing great work in Pasadena. So, one is actually a high school, and I think once you get established, you find out where the church is going to serve. We've got the high school, we've got the homeless transitional housing where families are getting off the streets and actually being taught to budget and get back on their feet again. We have 3 or 4 different areas where we are actively loving and pursuing these people. And once the people of the city start to get in your bones and in your soul, and I drive by Door of Hope, which is the name of this transitional housing for the homeless families, and you're just like, I love them, and I love that they're hearing Jesus, and his mercy is bringing them forth. And when I lose track of the faces and the people, I don't actually like LA at all. And I don't enjoy Pasadena, and it doesn't feel like home, and I feel like a sojourner, which we are, but the sojournering feels heavier than the integrating. And I think, on Saturday, I'm going to get to go to the high school, and we're going to do a beautification day. Well, when I get to go hang out with those students and talk to the principal and hang out with the teachers, that is where my heart gets revitalized for the love of a city that's actually super exhausting. Yeah, it kind of revitalizes that in me.
Amen. John.
Thank you, Rick. I've only been able to be here for a part of your talk, but your timing is perfect because you're talking about working with the homeless in the transient communities of LA and Pasadena. I'm moving back to New York City in 3 months to do the exact same thing, working with the homeless throughout Staten Island and the other boroughs. And it's been 20 years since I've done that work, and God finally gave me the green light. And I was wondering, in terms of your work with these populations, and the demographic is really quite large. It's not one subtype of person at all. What resources have you been able to access? I've already got a network of people I know, which is a huge help in New York that I'll be stepping into. But what are some of the resources in terms of networking with other organizations helping the homeless that have been most beneficial for you?
The homeless issue is an incredibly complex and difficult one, and no one organization can solve it. You have to work with all of them, but I'll give you one tiny thing. Beg and plead with your church to hire homeless people. We employ homeless folks in our church for 2 reasons. One, it gives them a stable, we employ them on Sunday mornings to do setup and take down, things like that. And it gives them a sense of worth and value. It gives them a little bit of a paycheck, and it gives them a resume. So they can say, for 2 years now, I've been gainfully employed at Grace Pasadena, and they can go and show somebody that. And it can get them Section 8 housing. That's the area that we can't do what the parachurch ministries can do for homelessness. We just can't. But we can do one little thing, and that's employ folks.
Amen.
So
That's a great suggestion. Question down front here, and then back.
I know.
With not only the high demands of ministry in general, but also the added demands of church planting, how have you found time, made a priority for not only self-care, but for care of your marriage?
Next question. Tanya told. I'll start. You can answer this, but she. Last year, a year and a half ago, Tanya said, we named our oldest son after a psychologist that we saw in Houston. So we have a deep sense of love for psychology, right? But last year, a year and a half ago, Tanya said, we need to work on our intimacy. And I thought, oh, that's awesome. We get to work on our sex life. She's like, no, idiot, our communication. And so we've been going back. We call it our very expensive date. And we go back once a week if we're in town and just sit and talk and work it through. But she can tell you what it brings up. I mean, it's brought up everything from things in my past that I'm just now dealing with, things in her past that she's dealing with, and we've been married 20, long time. 20, yeah, yes, exactly, exactly. So.
And it's our time together has kind of ebbed and flowed, right, throughout seasons. When the kids were little, now that we have 3 teens, it constantly looks different. One thing that we've been privy to that a lot of people aren't for various reasons, but at our 10th anniversary, my parents started coming out once a year and watching the kids for us for a week. So every spring, we have 7 days outside of Pasadena that is just for us to sleep. And we typically go to a beach and we lay there and do nothing. We don't really even talk all that much. So, I mean, truly, that 1 week is sort of like our 1 week deposit for the next 51 weeks that are coming up. But go ahead.
Well, another thing we did is we chose an area where we didn't have to do ministry at night.
Yeah.
That was really important to me from the start. So we live and work in an area where folks live and work. They're not commuting an hour and a half each way, so they're not coming home at 7 or 8 at night and then trying to spend time with their family and then trying to spend time with you. I can meet folks for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, and I have only had a standing appointment on Monday nights, and that's it. Other than that, I'm home, and that's one way we balanced.
And I think we have been able to have moments where I say, Brannin, you're not doing well right now, so you need to leave, and just come back tomorrow, or whatever the situation is. I actually cratered this summer, and he made me go away for a couple of days. But I think being each other's, or if you're not married, having someone, who can just say, I'm not sure you're doing well. You need to take some time off. You need to get away.
And being okay with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the idols of ministry is feeling like you've always got to be together.
Yeah,
And
right.
have it together. And one of the great truths of the gospel is that in your weakness, in the transparency about your weakness, there actually is something therapeutic and redemptive in that regard.
Yeah.
And one of the idols that we often leave seminary with is this idol, I'm going to have the perfect church and the perfect marriage.
And the perfect kids.
And the perfect kids. And it's a great danger, isn't it? Amen.
Yeah.
Amen. Question back, and then Matthew here.
Yeah, what would you say are some preliminary steps to starting a church from scratch? You have some experience, but you're in a new environment and you want to plant church. What are the preliminary steps? My question is twofold. The second one is, what if you're not married and you still want to press on with that vision? You are passionate about planting a church. Can singleness be a big problem in your way? Or would you say church planting is not for singles?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I think that context drives it. I do think that there are some places where you would plant a church where it would be very difficult to be single. And you can think about that being, a suburban area or an urban area. It might tempt a single person in different ways. It might not reach the culture in certain ways. But to say that a single person is not called to plant a church, I think is ludicrous. I do think that some of the preliminary steps are assessment. I think that we run across folks right now who are planting churches that are not called to plant churches. And we've just said we need more churches and we're okay, and if you raise your money, come and plant. And I think that's a disservice. So I think assessment is a huge thing. I think a qualified assessment really does help. And then one of the things that we noticed when we were here is we had folks around us saying, you need to go to seminary. The two of you need to go. And our church sent us, our friends sent us, everyone was behind us. But we ran into folks who just came to seminary because they wanted to come to seminary. I think you need a community around you saying, you need to plant a church. you cannot do anything but that. You need to go plant a church, which we had as well. Without that, I think that some of those preliminary steps we jump to too fast, and it becomes a failure.
And I think also being willing to wait on the Lord to say go.
Yeah.
We moved to LA, landed in Pasadena, and had a core group of maybe 15 that really, really, really wanted us to plant. And
Well, we also thought we were going to plant at 25 after
Oh,
marriage,
yeah.
and then we
That didn't
planted
work.
at 37.
yeah,
So,
it was a long, curvy road before we actually got released to plant. But Brannin and I just did not feel good about this core group of people. And they just wanted Brannin to start, they wanted him to start worship. And being true to that sort of deep gut instinct, the Holy Spirit in you, little by little, Brannin and I just did not feel like this was the core group that was going to really launch a healthy church forward. And so little by little, they're like, oh, never mind, we're going to go do something else because it's moving faster. Well, we ended up losing that entire core group of people. And long story short, there was a guy at Fuller who came and met with Brannin and said,
the very next day.
the very next day. And so it ended up that he was sent by the Lord to usher a new core group of people, and from there we started the church. So I think this sense of, you can go through gospel-centered church planning manuals, and some of those, obviously those benchmarks are important to hit before you launch, but ultimately, if it, really sitting still and seeing if you have a gut check. Because I'm really glad we didn't plant with that initial group of core people.
It would be a disaster.
Yeah. Somewhere there's got to be a Watergate in the background, huh?
Well, that is, you know that. That's Clay Cook, who's married to Becca Cook, who's
Yeah.
Becca
Is. So
Ford,
that
who's
connected.
Mike Ford's
Right.
daughter, who's President Ford's son. Yeah, Watergate.
It all
Comes
gets back to Watergate.
It does.
Yep.
Matthew.
My question is, we see increasingly mega churches in cities. The context where I'm coming from, when you think of church, you think of cities. Very few in the urban, rural areas and things like that. And my question is, why plant a church in an urban city when there is already possibility of other churches there? And the second question would be, there's this movement of, if you really want to survive in ministry in an urban setting, you probably have to have a profession to interact a little bit with what life is. What was that for you, going straight into church planting without having like a professional career or work life going on at the same time?
I think there's two parts to your first question. One, the dynamic of the mega church that's risen. The statistics that I've seen and what we've noticed personally is in the major cities of the United States, those churches are booming and growing, but they're not going deep. And so what's happening is you're finding a healthy number of Christians who have become disenfranchised in those churches, and they're coming to smaller, more community-centered type churches that, when I mean community, I mean like deep, intimate community, where they're in a church of 100 to 250 to 300 people, a much smaller setting where they can say, this is engaged in my life and my ministry, and it's teaching me. The depth that's here is something I've been longing for. So there's an exodus of those major churches. At the same time, while they're still growing, there's an exodus from them that is sending into these smaller gospel-driven churches, and we've seen that grow. Now, around the world, I don't know if that's exactly true. In Africa, that may not be the same case, where you've got these million-member churches that are popping up, and folks just growing. The second part to the question, how do you justify a new church plant when there's so many churches already? I think goes back to, I think it's Scazzaro or, I can't remember exactly who.
I think it is Pete.
Scazzaro says that new churches are the most influential in making new believers, in providing new opportunities for folks to serve, to give new to increase gospel dynamics in new areas of the city. There's no question in his statistic that new churches produce new Christians at a faster rate than evangelistic movements. So that's part of it. The bivocational piece, Tanya, you might want to answer from the city-to-city perspective.
What do you mean?
His second question was, how do you live and work in a city like Los Angeles or Boston or New York and not be bivocational? How can you plant a church and still afford to do it?
I don't know.
We found it's very hard. Again, internationally, if you're going back to Sierra Leone, that's where you're from, right? I heard a lot about you earlier. If you're going back to Sierra Leone, I don't know the dynamics that happen there, but here we need. What we're doing in Los Angeles is there's an area in LA that we've planted a church called East LA. That church has taken 5 years to get up and going. It has about 60 folks right now. And we've said every bit of tithe money that comes from that church goes towards ministry, but not towards the pastor's salary. We need to consider that pastor a missionary that we're supporting overseas, but he's here local. So 5 churches have come together to raise the salary for that pastor, which is just pennies compared to the rest of LA. But he's living and breathing and working there so that he can be free to do the ministry. We're having to get creative by having other churches come together to support certain folks. But we found that bivocational ministries are very, very hard to get church plants up and going. Very hard. Existing churches, maybe. Small churches for sure. But church plants have been hard with bivocational pastors.
Question back. What's that?
So my question was, sorry, really close. My question was, what did you do in that waiting time of the 3 years in LA, like what came to like worship and everything? Because I was listening, you were saying that some people were trying to push you all to start the worship and everything. So what did you do individually? Did you like find another church to visit or like everything during that time period?
We had a bit of a unique experience. I had gone to undergrad out in LA, and so we sort of knew the area a little bit, and we knew that LA was way too big, and we were way too naive to its demographics and its nuances to know right where we were going to plant right away. So we moved. We had been introduced to a pastor of a church plant in Pasadena. So we decided we're going to go out there, we're going to rent a place to live, and we are going to start worshiping with that church right away. We're not looking, we're just going for it. So right when we moved to LA, we just had a lot of church planters don't have an immediate church home. So we plugged into that church and we served them, and they knew that while we were doing that, we had raised support, some from Redeemer City to City, some from our old church in Dallas, and some from individual donors. They had sort of given us 2 years worth of mostly finances so we could rent a place and worship at that church plant. And then I was at home with the little kids that we had at the time, and Brannin was kind of looking at the demographics of the area and deciding where to plant. So that was when it had been about 2 years.
Well, we were also figuring out the city where other churches would be planted. So not only were we deciding where we would plant, but we were thinking about this would be a plant for somebody here, this would be a plant for somebody here, and we were engaged with existing church plants, finding them new pastors if a pastor had left, or we were starting other churches at the same time. So my job was to help the church planting movement get started at the same time of figuring out the area. LA is this mass urban sprawl, and Pasadena is kind of central to everything. If you don't need to live by the beach and you want to be close to downtown, Pasadena is kind of an area, and it just ended up being one that we said, one of the 3 areas we said we could plant in. But we were not idle trying to get a group together and trying to get it going. We were engaged in churches at the same time while we were gathering a core group.
So when that core group sort of disbanded, we were still being funded from our initial church planting purpose of coming out to LA to get churches on the same page, figuring out where they could plant, creating a church planting movement. So we had a job going while we could kind of wait for the church, for the group of people to launch with to come to pass. Does that answer your question?
A couple of things as we draw to a close. What I remember about Brannin was this persistent learner. He was constantly knocking on doors. And there's something about that insatiable curiosity which is really important to a church planter. To not settle for easy answers, to ask tough questions. And I remember Tanya, in a very different way, asking the tough questions about what ministry was going to be like for them together. And there's a persistence in both of them to ask really good questions. And sometimes as seminarians, we want the answers, but we're not quite sure we've asked the questions. And so I just appreciate you coming back and being honest and transparent with us. And there is something about a tender conscience that you see both in Tanya and in Brannin, that it is really an echo of all who sit in the middle of the gospel. That our own conscience, it becomes much more broken and tender by the virtue of being overwhelmed by God's grace towards us. And so we want to say a word of thanks to both of you coming back, that you should have come back a lot sooner, but we are grateful that you've been such friends of the seminary from the other coast, and also such passionate folk for the sake of the gospel, wherever God puts you, and to pay attention to what that means.